Good evening, everyone. This week's Parshas is Parshas Shoftim, Tavshin Pei Vav 5786. We will begin tonight with a discussion about appointing a Jewish king, and that we begin in Perek Yud Zayin, chapter 17, Pasuk Yud Daled, verse 14. Ki savor la'aretz, when you come to the land, Hashem that Hashem your God is giving to you. You shall take possession of it, and you shall settle in it. Yamart, and you will say, Asimo alai melech, I shall place upon myself a king, kochal hagoyim, like all the nations, asher sevivosai, that are around me. Soim tasim alech hamelech, you shall surely appoint a king over you. Soim tasim alech hamelech, you shall surely place over you a king, that Hashem your God shall choose him. From amongst your brethren, you shall place over yourself a king. You may not put over you a foreign person that is not your brother. Okay, so now there's a problem that all the commentaries face, which is that when we read again, Pasuk Yud Daled, that says, when you come to the land that Hashem your God gives you, and you'll take possession, you'll dwell in it, you'll settle in it, the Amart, and you will say, I shall place on myself a king, like all the nations that are around me. So, if the Torah phrases this as, and you will say, I will place a king over me, then that sounds like it's voluntary. There's no mitzvah per se to appoint a king. But if you say, I will appoint a king upon myself. The problem is that the next pasuk Tesvav, verse 15, says, Soim tasim alech hamelech, you shall surely appoint a king over yourself. If this was all just about, voluntarily deciding you want to have a king, then why would the Torah then use this very forceful wording of you shall surely place a king over you? Is it voluntary? Is it obligatory? If it's obligatory, the Torah can just say, place a king over yourselves. The fact that it starts off saying that the Amarta and you will say sounds like if you say, okay, if not. But when the Torah then says you shall surely place a king over you, that sounds like a mitzvah, like a commandment, like an obligation. So which one is it? Is it voluntary? Is it an obligation? A possibility that may come just from reading it is, if you say, then you have to do it. What does that mean? Okay. So I'm going to go through a couple of approaches here. Ramban Nachmanides, his approach is the following. That actually, when the Torah said there's actually a mitzvah, it is a mitzvah to appoint a king. When we were living in the land of Israel, and we had control of the land of Israel, and we had a Beis HaMikdash, we had a prophet, we had a mitzvah to appoint a king. Now, so why did the Torah say, Amarta, and you shall say? So first of all, he says that one has to understand in this context, the Amarta, and you will say, and you will say. It's an obligation. You will say it. Even though that wouldn't be the straightforward way of reading it, but that's the way you have to read it. The Amarta, and you will say. You have to say it, because you have the mitzvah to appoint the king. Now, at the same time, there's still a question about, but why does the Torah phrase it this way? Just say, place a king over yourself. Why does the Torah mention, and you will say? Therefore, he says, that is coming to teach us that actually, when the Jewish people want to have a king, it's not like they just decide and go forth and find someone. They have to say it to someone. That means they have to first come before the leadership at that time. The leadership of the Jewish people, before they had their first king, they had a leader. The leader was called a shofet, a judge. A judge was a leader. A judge had a lot of elements like a king, but he wasn't a full-fledged king. And therefore, but he's the leader. And there's also, as the Ramban says, there are the Kohanim Alavim, they're the Kohanim, the Levites. The Kohanim, the Levites, they were the spiritual leaders of the Jewish people at the time. And therefore, before you're gonna with the process of appointing a king is to go to the leadership and request the king. That's how you do it. That's how you do the mitzvah. That's how the mitzvah starts. You approach the leadership to appoint the king. But it's all about, it's a mitzvah, it's a commandment. Then at the same time, the Ramban says also that the fact that the Torah said, and you will say, which again, doesn't sound like a mitzvah. It really sounds more like a narrative, and you will say. The Ramban says, Nachmanides says, it's actually alluding to something in the future. And that is that in the book of Shmuel, Samuel 1, Perek Ches, chapter 8, there is where we have the Jewish people approaching the prophet Samuel, who was the leader, the judge, and the leader at the time, and they actually ask him for a king. And the reaction and the reaction there is very interesting. And the reaction there is, it says, this is in, like I mentioned, Perek Ches, chapter 8, Vayiskaptu kol ziknei Yisrael, all the elders of Israel gathered together, and they approached Shmuel. And they said to him, behold, you have become old, your children are not following in your ways, meaning they're not going to replace you. So now it is time, place over us a king, or place for us a king that will judge us like all the nations. And then it says, Vayera hadavar b'nei Shmuel. And this matter was not good in the eyes of Shmuel. Kasher amru tlenu melech l'shovteinu, when they said, give us a king to judge us. Vayispalo Shmuel al Hashem, so Shmuel davened to God. Vayemer Hashem el Shmuel. Hashem said to Shmuel, Shma b'kar la'am lecha shayemru elecha. Listen to whatever they're going to say. They're not rejecting you. Rather, they are rejecting me for being the king over them. But he told them anyway, go, tell them you'll appoint a king, but warn them what can happen when you appoint a king. And when Shmuel gets back to them, he tells them, look, if you make a king, the king has absolute power. He can, against anybody's will, take your sons and your daughters to serve him, to work for him. He can take over your land. Meaning, you have to realize there could be some negative results from having a king if the king acts in a certain way. I'm not going to say all those times when he takes someone for their service, it's going to be negative, but it could be. I mean, it's not necessarily the most positive experience for the parents. So Shmuel warned them. Even so, they said, we want a king. So the Ramban says that the Torah is already alluding to that. Now he points out that his basis to say this is the fact that when the Torah says that you'll come to the land, you'll take possession, you'll settle in it, and you'll say, I will place upon myself a king like all the nations around me. Why is the Torah mentioning, even if it's not a mitzvah, it's not a mitzvah, whatever way it is, the point is that the Torah is saying this is what you're going to say. Why would the Torah say that you'll request the king by saying, I will place over me a king like all the nations around me? What's the point of that, like all the nations around me? You want to have a king because you want to be like other nations? Ramban says that's not a good reason for a king, to want a king. Why would the Torah mention it? Therefore, the Ramban says, because the Torah is alluding to what was going to happen in the future. Because when they did actually ask for a king, they said, give us a king who will judge us like all the nations. And from the Ramban, it would seem that was the problem there. The problem there was when they made the request as, give us a king like all other nations. That was the problem. Okay, that's what Ramban's approach is that it's a mitzvah to appoint the king. The commentary of Seforno says like this. Commentary of Seforno says that, first of all, he addresses what does it mean? What does it mean when the Torah does tell us that they're saying, I will place by myself a king like all the nations? What's the point of saying that? The Seforno says the meaning of that is, Shatia malchus loy ulazarai. The point of saying a king like all the nations means that the monarchy is his and his children's. It passes on. Loy ki inyan hashayftim shaya hashayfet meilachu bovad. Unlike the Shoftim, the judges, as I said before there was a Jewish king, there were Shoftim, judges. The books of Tanakh, after the Chumash, you have the book of Yoshua, Joshua. Then after Joshua becomes Shoftim, the judges. The Shoftim were the leaders of the Jewish people. They were the recognized leader. And they are, like I said, in many aspects, they were like a king, but they were not a full-fledged king. And one of the aspects in which they were not like a king was the fact that a shofet, a judge, had no guarantees that his son was going to take over. It didn't pass on. And therefore, but when you go, right. So you have to, but the Jewish people's request was they want a judge, they want a king. They want a king who the monarchy is going to get passed on. And he continues when he mentions the fact that a shofet is different, and he says, and regarding a shofet, to be a king, meaning to be a leader, that already the Jewish people knew that they had to do that when they came to the land, because Moshe, before he died, back in Parshas Pinchas, asks Hashem, that the assembly of Hashem should not be like sheep without a shepherd. So a shepherd they need, that's not a question. Therefore, that there should be a leader that was called a shofet, that was understood they have to do. However, that this leader should be like all other kings, which means that he holds on to the kingdom monarchy for himself and his children. It's a real possession. Nimas Eitzel Kol Yisparach, that Hashem does not like. Now, Hashem does not like that. Now, okay. Now, first of all, why would the Jewish people insist on that? Like, why is it so important to them to have such a king? I don't have a good answer. I don't have a real answer for it. I don't know, like, why it's so important for them to have a king that the monarchy passes on, unless it's a certain kind of status. That's part of being like the nations around the world, of the other nations who have a king. There's something about the fact that this king is someone that has real possession of the monarchy, and that to them was important, like as a status. That to Hashem is not good. And I think the understanding to that is the fact that this monarch who has so much possession over his monarchy now gives an impression of power that at some level actually, so to speak, gets in the way of the Jewish people realizing who is the ultimate king. The ultimate king is Hashem. And the king of the Jewish people, if there's going to be a king, is an agent of Hashem. But the fact that you have a king that has so much possession and so much strength of the monarchy that it passes on to his children, that is something that Hashem did not want, because in some ways that could infringe upon the Jewish people recognizing who is the real king. Nonetheless, Hashem said that when the Jewish people make that request, that request is going to be answered. However, if they make that request, they may not choose anyone other than what Hashem chooses. Right? Meaning he has to be someone who is righteous, will not cause the Jewish people to sin. He shouldn't be a foreigner. He should be from amongst the Jewish people, even though he may be a fine person, even though he may be a great warrior. But nonetheless, the king that you're going to appoint has to be very specific, Hashem says. Meaning, you're going to ask for a king, and you're going to ask for a king in the wrong way, because you're going to say, I want a king like all the nations. That's the wrong way to ask. That's the wrong kind of king or leader to ask for. Nonetheless, Hashem says, if you ask for that kind of king, you shall surely appoint a king that Hashem your God chooses. That person who you're going to choose, that person is going to be that absolute monarch. So much so that his monarchy is going to pass on to his children. That must be someone that Hashem will choose, which is the way kings were chosen, through a prophet. It has to be someone Hashem is going to choose. It has to be someone that's going to be righteous, lead the Jewish people in observance of the Torah. And so it's not an obligation, essentially. It's, if you're going to choose a king, then you have to choose the king that Hashem wants. And then he goes into to mentions the fact that when the Jewish people did go ahead and ask for a king, as we just mentioned before from the book of Shmuel, from the book of Samuel, He warned them that things can go bad. And he explains that that's actually a punishment. For asking for the king in the wrong way, things can turn out not the way you want it to turn out. And he compares it to something we're going to have in next week's parsha, which is the law about, let's call the Yafas Torah, the beautiful woman. It talks about how a Jewish soldier goes out to war. He sees amongst the captives a beautiful Gentile woman, becomes infatuated, and the Torah says, you can marry her. But at the same time, our sages say that, and this is again based on the next week's parsha, how things are laid out in the parsha one after the other, that if you marry such a woman, it's not going to be good. The children that are going to come out aren't going to be good. Which means you have something where, the Torah basically sees that a person comes into a certain, they have a certain desire for something, and, as a human being, and therefore the Torah, and it's not something that the Torah understands, not something just to ignore. It has to be dealt with. But know that if this is where this is what you come to, the results aren't going to be good. That's the same thing here. You're going to ask for a king in the wrong way, so Hashem is going to say, usher, forbidden. The Torah decides not to forbid this. Let the Jewish people have it. It's not the right way to ask, not the right thing to ask for. Let them have it. But know that it's not that things may not work out very well. So according to the Seforno, it would seem that he is understanding the verses of the Torah, not so much as a mitzvah, but as a situation. That if the Jewish people ask for a king in this manner, that they can have the king in that manner, but that king has to be someone that Hashem chooses. Now, at the same time, it is clear from the Seforno that a Shofet type leader, that kind of leader that has king quality, that has qualities of a king to him, that he's understood the Jewish people knew that they had to do, that they had to have. But that kind of monarch that passes things on, that the monarchy passes on the children, that was not meant to be wasn't meant to be the mitzvah of a king. What he calls it, he says they were commanded to have a shofet. They were commanded. That's the word that he says. That seems to be understood as a commandment. They needed to have that kind of king. They had to appoint that kind of a king, which they always had. But the kind of king that now would be requested, a king that can pass on the monarchy to his children, that is what the Torah is talking about. The Torah is not pleased with it, but the Torah says, if you do make such a king, you have to make sure that that king is going to be a king that is righteous, which is interesting. According to this, we're saying the king has to be righteous, but the warning that is given about what could happen, which the Seforno calls an onesh, does that mean that the righteous king may take the children as workers and as subjects and people that have to work for him, which is not wrong on his part, but not pleasant on the part of the parents? Or does it mean that at the end of the day, you'll start off with a righteous king, but at some point of time, you may end up with not such a righteous king, which we know did happen amongst the Jewish people. Okay, so that's the Seforno's approach. Then there's the Orach Chaim's approach. The Orach Chaim, again, has this, has the question about, is it a mitzvah, is it not a mitzvah? And he starts off with the following. He says that there's two types of kings, or two, let's call them candidates for king. One is someone that is a great warrior. He can lead his people into war with his great military prowess, and he's a great warrior, and that's a king that was the kings of other nations. That was their job, that was their appointment, that was their greatness, that they would be that kind of leader, leading their subjects into war and to be victorious. That is not the kind of king that Hashem wants the Jewish people to have. Because a person who is like that if that's the qualities of his being the king, that's not typically a person who's doing things for the sake of God. That's typically a person who does things for, his own self-aggrandizement, for material reasons. That's not the kind of king that then, and not typically the kind of king that's going to lead them to be righteous. Then there's another king, a king that is requested because that kind of king is going to be a glory for the Jewish people. Meaning this is going to be someone that brings honor to the Jewish people. And someone that Hashem, in his merit, will save the Jewish people when they need to be saved, as we find by the judges, as we find by the righteous kings, such as David HaMelech, such as King David. That is something that Hashem is fine with. You want that kind of a king? That's fine. So it all depends what kind of a king you're requesting. Therefore, the Torah says, if you will say, I shall place upon myself a king like all the nations, which means they're requesting a king like all the other nations, the warrior king. Okay, if that's what you say, if that's what you request, the next thing the Torah says is, you shall place upon yourself a king that Hashem chooses. Meaning, you want a king that's going to be like the other kings, the warrior king, you shall appoint a king that Hashem will choose. That is meant to be a mitzvah, and it's meant to say also, and to detract what was said before. Don't ask for a king. When you say you want a king like all the nations, you want the warrior king, place upon yourself a king that Hashem, your God, will choose. There's a mitzvah, and the mitzvah is to choose the right kind of king, the righteous king. That is and we know that as the Gemara, as the Talmud tells us, the Ar Chaim cites, we don't that the appointment of a king comes through the great the highest court of the Jewish people, the Sanhedrin, with a prophet, and that's the kind of king. That means that's the kind of king that Hashem chooses. That's not the warrior king. That's the righteous king. Now, so therefore, again, as he says that this is the pasuk is a mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah, and it's also basically, and it's also saying that the king you asked for, that's not the kind of king that you're supposed to be putting over yourself. And therefore, he goes into goes back to what happened in the times of Shmuel, and the problem is, and there again, they were, why did Hashem was so upset with the fact they asked for a king? I mean, even if it's not a mitzvah, even if it's not a mitzvah, but if it's voluntary, it's permissible, then what's the problem? Says the Ar Chaim, the problem is that, as they said, to judge us, appoint for us a king, to judge us like all the nations. That was the problem. If they would have asked that in the right way, for a righteous king, for a king that will bring true glory to the Jewish people, then they would have been fulfilling the mitzvah, meaning then they would have started the mitzvah process for asking for the right king. They didn't ask for the right kind of king. And therefore, therefore Hashem was angry. They're not asking for the right kind of king. They're asking for the king that will judge us, lead us like all the other nations. That's the wrong kind of king. Therefore, Hashem was angry at that request. If they would have requested the right type of king, then he says they would have fulfilled the positive commandment, which I believe means they would have started the process of the positive commandment of appointing a king. Now, before we move on, because then the Ar Chaim's comment is not over. Before we go on, I just want to point out something. So the Ar Chaim, when he was talking about the two types of kings, you had the king that was the warrior king, we'll call him, and the righteous king. The righteous king, the example he gives is Abarbanel, King David. Now, it would seem like that many people always refer to King David as the warrior king because he fought so many battles, which he did fight many battles, and he was very successful in his battles. And he brought tranquility and peace from all enemies of the Jewish people. The Jewish people were in a state of security because of his wars. So you say David HaMelech was a warrior king, wasn't he? But I think the answer is that's not why David HaMelech was chosen. God chose David as the king after Shaul lost the monarchy because of who he was. Now, once he became king, and he was a righteous king, Hashem helped him to be able to be successful in his wars. Hashem gave him the ability to be successful in wars. But he wasn't appointed king for that. That wasn't why he was appointed king. But at the end of the day, the righteous king also will have the merits, as Ar Chaim said, to save the Jewish people, to lead the Jewish people in war, because that's all part of the righteousness and his merits. And it doesn't mean there's not going to be wars. David HaMelech fought wars. But nonetheless, that's not why he was appointed as the king. And therefore, he fits what the Ar HaChaim says, what the Jewish king should be like. Now, the Ar HaChaim continues by citing the Talmud in Sanhedrin, Tractate Sanhedrin, where there the Talmud cites an argument amongst the Tanoim, amongst the sages of the times of the Mishnah. And there it says like this: Rabbi Yehuda says, Gimel mitzvahs nitztavu Yisrael b'chnisasan la'aretz. Jewish people were commanded 3 mitzvahs, 3 commandments upon entering the land. La'amid lehem melech, to appoint a king. Ulahachris zarei shal Amalek, and to destroy the descendants of Amalek. V'livnei beis habachira, and to build the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple. So Rabbi Yehuda says it's a mitzvah to appoint the king. Okay. Rabbi Naroi Omer, but another sage known as Rabbi Naroi, Lo nemra parsha zu ela kenega Torah masan shenema v'amarto simalai melech. The whole portion of the Torah that talks about appointing a king, which is what we have in our parsha, that's only a response to the Jewish people's request or demand, which would sound like, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is no mitzvah. The Jewish people asked for it. Okay, so they got a mitzvah. So now they'll get a king. But it seems not to be a mitzvah. He seems to be saying not like Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said that there is a mitzvah. It's one of the 3 mitzvahs. And the Rai says when it comes to the king, that was just a response to their demands. Okay, well, if so, if there is no mitzvah according to Rabbi Rai, how does he deal with the wording that says, Som tasim melech hamelech, you shall surely appoint a king? It's not a mitzvah, it's not a commandment. So why is it being so forceful when it says that? So therefore he explains in the following way. And this is another explanation to what the problem was when the Jewish people requested a king like all the other people. If the Jewish people are worthy enough and don't ask for a king, then who is their king? Hashem is their king. As was said, as eventually, Shmuel said to the Jewish people, even after appointing the first king, Hashem Elokeichem Malkechem. This is later on in the book of Shmuel. Hashem, your God, is your king. But so if the Jewish people don't ask for a king, and they're not asking a king because they're righteous enough to understand that their king is Hashem. That ultimate power, that ultimate leader is Hashem. Of course there's a shofet, there's a judge. There has to be a flesh and blood leader. But a melech, a king, that absolute power, if the Jewish people are worthy, Jewish people are righteous, they know the ultimate power, the ultimate king is Hashem. And if that is what they want, then the Rebbeinu Shalom will be their only king. But once the Jewish people start asking for a king, meaning they're not on that level. They're not on that level to be able to live as Hashem being their king. Now, of course, we always are reminding ourselves Hashem is the absolute king. But if the Jewish people can't just work with that, if the authority of a king, it can only in their eyes can only be a human king. They can't relate enough somehow to Hashem being their only king, which of course ultimately we always have to remember. But in living their regular lives, living their lives here on earth, if they ask for a king, which means that they're looking for that human flesh and blood king as their leader, which is again, that's going down. That's not where they should be. They should be at a higher level. But if they actually come down a level and ask for a king, at that point the Torah says, Saim tasim alech hamelech. At that point, everybody agrees there's a mitzvah to have a king. Meaning, if the Jewish people are at the level that they shouldn't be asking, the Torah, when the Torah said, and you will say, right? At that point, that was a request that shows, and the Jewish people come to the point making that request, means they're not on the level of just recognizing Hashem as their only king. And once they're in that kind of state, once they've fallen a level and in that kind of state, at that point, there's a mitzvah to have a king. Then there's a mitzvah to have a king. Because if this is what the Jewish people need, if they're not at the level that they could just live with Hashem being their king, they need a human king. At that point, there's a mitzvah. Same to Melech. You shall appoint a king. Because at that point, then already, it becomes a mitzvah. That's what he says. Once they ask for a king, that means they can't just live with Hashem as their ultimate power. They need something flesh and blood in front of them in order to recognize that power and to utilize what that power means to them, to get from it, to live by it, to live with it, and eventually, and actually to grow from it. If they're already at that point that they can't do that just with recognizing Hashem as their king, then it becomes a mitzvah to appoint a king. If that's where they're at, that's what they need, and then there's a mitzvah to have it. So that's how Chaim explains that argument in Sanhedrin. Rabbi Yehuda says it's a mitzvah, finished. One of the 3 mitzvahs you have to do. Says Rabbi Naroi, when the Torah talks about it, that's not saying there should be a mitzvah. That's a response. That's not an automatic mitzvah. It's a response to a request. If the request is not made, no king. Once there is a request made, then there's a mitzvah to have a king. Thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful evening.